Every holiday, it was the same. My hands worked from sunrise, chopping, roasting, seasoning, sweating in the kitchen to make sure every dish was perfect. 16 dishes this time. Family recipes, crowd favorites, last-minute requests piled onto my already long list. I smiled through it all, believing foolishly that my place in this family was carved out by the care I gave. When dinner was finally ready, the platters steaming and perfect, I wiped my hands, smoothed my apron, and looked for a seat at the table. But there were none. Every chair filled, every place setting taken. Laughter rang out, glasses clinked. Forks dug in, but not a single person thought to make room for me. I stood there for a moment, heart hammering in my chest, humiliated and invisible. But if they thought I would accept my place standing on the sidelines, forgotten after all I had given, they were about to learn they had misjudged me terribly. Because that night, I didn't just walk away. I changed everything. Have you ever poured your heart into caring for others, only to find yourself left out? Share your experience in the comments, and subscribe for more powerful stories of dignity, redemption, and finding strength when others least expect it. Growing up, I had always been taught that family was everything. You put them first, you gave without keeping score, you showed up even when it hurt. And I lived by that rule for most of my life, believing that the love and loyalty I poured out would eventually be returned in kind. Holidays, birthdays, anniversaries, they all became opportunities for me to show my devotion through action, usually in the form of cooking. It wasn't just a meal, it was a labor of love. Every dish I prepared carried a piece of my heart, my memories, my history. When the call came for this latest gathering, I wasn't surprised when they asked me to handle the cooking. 16 dishes, they said, almost laughing about how no one else could do it like you. I smiled through the phone, nodded even though they couldn't see me, and started planning immediately. I mapped out the groceries, the timing, the recipes, rearranging my week around the demands they had so easily placed upon me. It didn't occur to me to say no. It never had. The night before the gathering, I stayed up late, chopping vegetables, marinating meats, baking desserts from scratch because store-bought simply wouldn't do. My kitchen became a symphony of sizzling pans, fragrant spices, and endless motion. My back ached, my feet throbbed, but there was a satisfaction in it too, the quiet, stubborn pride of someone who believed that hard work would translate into love. I arrived early the next day, arms laden with trays and casserole dishes, my car packed to the brim. No one came out to help me unload. I made 3 trips back and forth from the driveway to the kitchen, while everyone else sipped coffee and laughed in the living room. I brushed off the slight, telling myself they were busy, distracted, unaware. I arranged everything meticulously. On the long dining table, roast beef glistening under a blanket of gravy, golden pies, creamy pastas, vibrant salads, warm bread rolls lined up like soldiers ready for battle. I smiled as the family began to gather around, exclaiming over the spread, snapping photos for social media, praising the food with mouths full and hands reaching for seconds before I could even sit down. I moved to the side, wiping my hands on a dish towel, waiting for a lull in the chaos so I could finally fix a plate for myself. But as I glanced around the table, a cold realization crept over me. Every chair was filled, every seat taken. Laughter and conversation buzzed around me, but no one looked my way. No one noticed I was still standing. No one offered to scoot over, to pull up an extra chair, to even acknowledge the woman who had spent days ensuring this meal even existed. I stood there for a long moment, the weight of exhaustion and heartbreak heavier than any tray I had carried. Part of me wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it. Another part of me wanted to cry. But the strongest part, the part that had been quietly growing inside me for months, maybe even years, finally spoke up. Not out loud, not yet, but firmly, undeniably in the pit of my soul. Enough. Enough standing on the sidelines. Enough being celebrated only for what I could provide, not for who I was. Enough believing that love had to be earned through endless Service. I didn't cause a scene. I didn't shout or slam dishes. I simply turned, walked back into the kitchen, and began packing up the food I had so painstakingly prepared. Tray by tray, dish by dish, I covered everything, sealing it all away from hands that had already grabbed more than they had given. A few heads turned, puzzled, but no one said anything. No one stopped me. I loaded the food back into my car with the same hands that had carried it in, hands that had cooked, served, given without hesitation. Only now those hands were steady with resolve. When the last tray was loaded, I stood for a moment by the open door, looking back at the house where I had spent so many years, giving so much and receiving so little. I didn't feel angry, surprisingly. I felt something deeper, calmer, a release. They had made it clear where I stood. I was simply choosing to stand somewhere else now. Somewhere I was seen. Somewhere I was valued. Somewhere I belonged to myself first and foremost. As I drove away, the setting sun bathed the road ahead in gold, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel small or invisible. I felt powerful. I felt free. Driving home with the trays of untouched food stacked neatly in my car, I thought about every moment that had led me to that evening. It wasn't just this one dinner. It wasn't even just the countless meals before it. It was years, decades, of believing that my value was tied to how much I could do for others, how small I could make myself to fit into the cracks of their busy lives. I thought about birthdays, where I had baked cakes that were devoured without a thank you, about family reunions where I stood in the background while others took credit for the warmth and welcome I had quietly created, about hospital stays and graduations and holidays where my role was clear: be useful, be silent, be invisible once your service is done. And every time I told myself it was love, that love was meant to be selfless. That if I just gave enough, stayed good enough, one day they would see me, not just as a fixture, but as a person worthy of being celebrated, included, valued. That hope had kept me moving for so long, like a runner chasing a finish line that kept shifting just out of reach. But as the city lights blurred past my windows, I realized something painfully liberating. They were never going to see me in the way I wanted them to. Not because they were incapable of love, but because I had taught them not to. I had taught them that my love was endless and unconditional, that my sacrifices required no acknowledgement, that my seat at the table was not guaranteed but earned over and over again through labor they had long since stopped noticing. In trying to love them unconditionally, I had set no conditions for how I should be treated, and in doing so, I had slowly, invisibly erased myself. When I pulled into my driveway, the house looked different. It wasn't bigger or grander. It didn't sparkle with the glow of celebration or family laughter. It was just a small, tidy home, quiet and still in the night. But it was mine. Every inch of it reflected the life I had built, the life I had tended to even as I spent so much of myself tending to others. Inside, I unloaded the trays carefully, stacking them on the counter, the smell of roasted meats and spices filling the kitchen with a richness that felt almost defiant. This feast, this labor, would not go to waste. I picked up the phone and made a few calls, to neighbors, to old friends, to a few women from my church group who I knew would never turn down a warm meal and good company. Within an hour, my house was filled with people. People who brought bottles of wine and homemade desserts, who laughed loudly and hugged tightly, who sat wherever they could find space without caring about fancy place settings or matching silverware. We ate until we were full, we talked until our throats were hoarse, and we laughed until tears streamed down our faces. And in the midst of it all, I realized something I should have known all along. Love isn't proven by sacrifice. It's proven by joy, by mutual care. By the simple, beautiful act of seeing each other fully, flaws and all, and choosing to make room anyway. That night, in my little house filled with mismatched chairs and warm light, I finally sat down, Not at the kids' table, not on the sidelines, not standing in the kitchen waiting to be noticed, but at the center of a gathering built on real connection, real gratitude, real love. And for the first time in as long as I could remember, I felt full, not just in my stomach, but in my soul. In the days that followed my quiet rebellion, word spread through the family like wildfire. The first few texts came almost immediately, sharp and incredulous. "Where did you go?" one cousin wrote. "Why did you leave?" another asked, as if the answer wasn't painted plainly across their memory of that evening. I ignored most of the messages at first, letting them pile up, unread and unanswered. I wasn't ready to dive back into a world that had so easily erased me. I needed space to let my decisions settle into my bones, space to grieve the loss of the illusions I had carried for too long. But silence, as I learned, is its own kind of message, and soon enough the tone of their inquiries shifted. Hurt feelings were weaponized. Accusations replaced confusion. "You embarrassed us. You made a scene. You ruined the evening for everyone." It stunned me how quickly the narrative flipped, how effortlessly they cast me as the villain in a story they had written without my consent. They spoke of my absence as if it were an act of aggression, ignoring entirely the much quieter cruelty of having been forgotten, left without a seat at a table I had built with my own 2 hands. It was a painful realization that people who benefit from your silence will always view your boundaries as betrayal. But even through the sting of their words, I held firm. I didn't respond to accusations hurled in anger. I didn't defend my choices to those who had never once defended my dignity. I stayed quiet, but not the quiet of submission I had once lived in. This was the quiet of strength, of self-respect, of choosing not to pour my energy into proving my worth to people determined not to see it. Still, the consequences rippled through my life in small, steady waves. Invitations to family gatherings dried up. Group chats moved on without me. Holidays that had once been bustling and chaotic were now silent and still, the absence sharp and undeniable. It hurt. Of course it hurt. I hadn't walked away from them lightly. I had loved them deeply, fully, with a kind of faith that was now left cradled in my hands like something broken and precious all at once. But even in the loneliness, I found something I hadn't known I needed. Freedom. Freedom from being taken for granted. Freedom from being valued only for what I could give, never for who I was. Freedom from the exhausting, endless climb toward approval that was always just out of reach. Slowly, I filled my life with new connections, new traditions. I hosted small dinners with friends who insisted I sit first, who passed dishes to me before filling their own plates, who saw me not as the help, but as the heart of the gathering. I traveled to places I had long dreamed of visiting, taking in sunsets over oceans and mountains without having to rush back to meet someone else's demands. I learned to celebrate holidays in ways that honored the spirit of the season rather than the expectations of others. And through it all, the ache softened, becoming less of a wound and more of a scar, a reminder of a lesson painfully earned but deeply cherished. I didn't stop loving my family. Love, after all, isn't something you can neatly turn off like a faucet. But I loved them now from a distance, with boundaries drawn not in anger, but in hard-won wisdom. I could miss them without inviting them, back into a space where they had once trampled so carelessly. I could forgive them without forgetting what it had cost me to finally choose myself. And as the month stretched into a year and the year into another, I realized that sometimes the hardest part of healing isn't walking away. It's staying away, even when the loneliness tugs at you with familiar hands. It's trusting that the seat you finally claimed for yourself is worth protecting, even if it means sitting at your own table, alone if necessary. Because there is dignity in solitude, and peace in choosing yourself, and strength in knowing that you no longer have to earn your place in anyone's life, not even your family's. It's a strange thing, the way emotional wounds heal differently from the ones we can see. A cut on your hand scabs over, a bruise darkens and fades, but a broken heart, one worn down by years of giving and not being seen, heals more like a hidden fracture, mending itself deep beneath the surface where no one else can see the slow, painful work of it. After the fallout with my family, I spent a lot of time alone, but it wasn't the lonely kind of solitude that gnaws at you from the inside out. It was a solitude I chose, a deliberate turning inward, a way of tending to the parts of myself I had neglected for far too long. I stopped measuring my days by how much I accomplished for others and started asking myself what I needed, what I wanted. Simple questions, but ones I had forgotten how to answer. I realized how often I had silenced my own desires in the name of service, how many times I had swallowed my own sadness to keep the peace. I thought back to all the gatherings where I stood at the sink scrubbing dishes while laughter rang out from the living room, to all the holidays where I worked behind the scenes like a ghost, making sure everyone else had what they needed. I thought about the countless meals prepared, the gifts bought, the favors done, and how rarely anyone paused to ask if I was okay, if I wanted to sit and just be for a while instead of always doing. It wasn't anger that filled me when I thought about those things. It was grief. Grief for the woman I had been, the woman who thought that love had to be earned through endless, invisible work. But as the months passed, that grief gave way to something sturdier, something more enduring. Self-respect, self-trust, a deep, unwavering sense of my own worth that no one else's recognition or lack of it could touch. I stopped waiting for apologies that would never come. I stopped rehearsing conversations in my head where I explained my side, hoping for understanding. I understood now that some people will never be able to give you the respect you deserve, not because you're unworthy, but because they are unwilling or unable to see beyond their own expectations. I started creating small rituals of care for myself, lighting a candle with my morning coffee, buying myself flowers for no reason at all, taking long walks without a destination just to feel the sun on my face. I filled my home with colors and textures that made me happy, not worrying about anyone else's taste or opinion. I learned to sit with my own company and enjoy it, to savor the quiet instead of fearing it. And in doing so, I realized that I was no longer waiting to be invited to someone else's table. I was building my own, sturdy and wide and welcoming, a table where I set the terms, where my presence was not a favor to others, but a celebration of my own life. The memories of that night when I packed up the food and left still visited me, sometimes, but not as sharp, stabbing pains. They came like distant echoes, reminders of a life I had outgrown, a life where I confused sacrifice with belonging. I understand now that true belonging doesn't require you to give up pieces of yourself. It welcomes all of you, just as you are, without condition or expectation. That realization didn't erase the sadness entirely, but it gave it context. It turned the sadness into something bearable, something I could hold without letting it define me. When people asked about my family, I spoke honestly, but without bitterness. We're not close anymore, I would say. And that's okay. Because it was okay. It had to be. My life was not lesser because some relationships had ended. It was fuller because I had made room for new connections, deeper friendships, and, most importantly, a stronger relationship with myself. I no longer lived my life trying to earn a seat at anyone's table. I built my own. And around it, I gathered those who valued me not for what I could do for them, but for who I was. The woman who stayed up all night cooking 16 dishes without complaint still lived inside me, but she no longer did it hoping someone would save her a chair. She did it because she wanted to, for people who would hand her a plate first, who would laugh with her at the table, not leave her standing unseen in the corner. And in that quiet, powerful shift, I found something I had been chasing all my life without knowing it: freedom. As autumn settled in with its cooler breezes and gold-tinged skies, I found that my life had begun to weave itself into something calmer, steadier. The urgency I once felt to explain myself, to fix what had broken between me and my family, faded like a tide pulling back from the shore. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't even sad most days. There was a lightness in waking, up and knowing that the only expectations placed on me were the ones I set for myself. There was a kind of quiet pride in planning my days around what nourished me. Long walks through the park with a thermos of tea, evenings curled up with novels I had been meaning to read for years, impromptu dinners with friends who showed up, not for what I could give, but simply because they enjoyed my company. I hosted small gatherings now and then, dinners with neighbors or old friends where the rule was simple. Everyone brought something, everyone helped clean up, and most importantly, everyone had a seat at the table. No one stood on the sidelines. No one was forgotten. I made sure of that, not from bitterness, but because I had learned how sacred it is to be seen. These evenings weren't grand or fancy, but they were rich with laughter and genuine connection, the kind of gatherings that fill a house with more than just noise. They fill it with belonging. One Sunday afternoon, as I watered the plants, on my porch, my neighbor's young daughter wandered over. She was holding a homemade card, her tiny fingers sticky with glue and glitter. "This is for you," she said shyly. I unfolded it carefully, revealing a bright crayon drawing of my little house surrounded by flowers and smiling stick figures. Inside, in uneven letters, it read, "Thank you for being nice." Such a simple sentiment, but it hit me harder than any grand gesture ever could. In her innocent way, she had seen me, not for what I could do or provide, but simply for who I was. I knelt down, hugged her tightly, and thanked her as my eyes stung with the kind of tears that heal instead of wounds. That small moment reminded me of the life I had built since walking away from the people who once overlooked me. It wasn't a life filled with accolades or big, sweeping validations. It was a life stitched together from small acts of respect, kindness, and mutual care, both from others and, most importantly, from myself. There were still days when the ache of missing family surprised me, a song on the radio or a whiff of a familiar recipe pulling me back into memories sweeter than the reality had ever been. But even then, I didn't let the sadness swallow me. I let it visit, let it remind me of how far I had come, and then I let it go, knowing that the woman I had become deserved a life rooted in love that was whole and reciprocal. I had stopped, begging for a seat at tables where I was merely tolerated. I had built a home where I was celebrated simply for existing. And in that home, both within my four walls and within my heart, there was always a seat for anyone who knew the true meaning of love, not as an obligation, but as a choice freely made day after day. Just when I thought the dust had finally settled and my life had found its new, peaceful rhythm, the second wave came, unexpected, sharp, and painful in a way that only family can inflict. It began with a phone call one late afternoon as the sun dipped low behind the trees. My sister's name flashed across the screen, a rare occurrence these days. Part of me hesitated before answering, my heart instinctively bracing itself for the possibility that this wasn't a call of reconciliation, but something else, and I was right. After a few strained pleasantries, she launched into the real reason for the call. There was another family gathering coming up, a birthday, a big one, the kind that draws out distant cousins and second aunts I hadn't seen in years. They wanted me to come, not because they missed me, not because they wanted to make amends, but because, in her words, nobody can handle the food the way you do. You know how to keep everyone happy. I listened, stunned into silence by the audacity of it all. After months of silence, after being left standing alone in the kitchen while they filled plates and chairs without a second thought, after being treated as if my only value was in what I could provide, they were reaching out not to offer love or apology, but to ask for labor. Again. It would have been easy to fall back into old patterns, to hear the plea in her voice and mistake it for affection, to confuse being needed with being wanted. But I had learned too much to be fooled now. I asked simply, "Who's cooking for me?" She laughed awkwardly, brushing off the question. "You know how it is. We all have our roles." And there it was, laid bare without even an attempt to hide. It. In their eyes, my role was fixed, my place at the stove permanent, my worth tied irrevocably to my ability to serve. Not my smile, not my laughter, not my memories or my stories or my love, just my usefulness. I told her calmly that I would not be attending, that my days of breaking my back in the kitchen while everyone else celebrated without a second thought were over. She sputtered, tried to guilt me, even played the nostalgia card, talking about how much the family missed the way things used to be. But the way things used to be had nearly broken me, and I would not walk willingly back into that. I ended the call politely, firmly, and sat for a long moment in the quiet house afterward, feeling the weight of what I had just done. Drawing boundaries with strangers is easy. Drawing them with the people you once built your world around is like carving out a piece of your own heart. And yet, even through the ache, I felt a profound sense of rightness. I had chosen myself again. I had honored the woman I had fought to become. Over the next few days, the fallout was predictable. More calls came, some pleading, some angry, some laden with guilt and passive aggression. I didn't respond. I didn't engage. I didn't owe explanations to people who had made it abundantly clear that my voice only mattered when it was saying, yes. I poured my energy instead into the life I had built, the friends who called just to say hello, the neighbors who invited me for dinner without expecting anything in return, the little rituals of care that stitched my days together with quiet joy. It hurt, yes, to be seen so clearly, not as a loved one, but as a service provider whose absence was only noticed when it caused inconvenience. But it also healed something deeper, to stand firm, to refuse to be pulled back into a version of myself that survived on crumbs. I realized that true love, the kind that doesn't ask you to bleed yourself dry for it, would never require such sacrifices. And slowly, that truth became a balm, softening the sharp edges of rejection, turning the scars into strength. In choosing not to return to the table where I was only ever valued for what I could bring, I had opened up space for a life where I was valued simply for being. And that, I knew now, was the only seat truly worth fighting for. As winter crept, in with its early darkness and biting winds, my world continued to grow stronger, steadier, and quieter. There were moments when loneliness tapped gently at the edges of my peace, whispering memories of full houses and loud dinners, of holiday traditions that now sat tucked away in the dusty corners of my mind. But I had learned to greet that loneliness, like an old acquaintance, to sit with it for a while, to listen to what it had to say, and then let it leave without inviting it to stay. My life was no longer built around who might come to the table, but around the strength I had found in setting it for myself. Invitations to family events stopped altogether after I declined that birthday gathering. No more casual texts asking me to bake pies or cook Thanksgiving dinner. No more phone calls needing last-minute help. It was as if I had vanished from their map, erased because I refused to be the compass that always pointed home. There was grief in that realization, grief in knowing that my presence had been valued only when it served a purpose, not simply for the love I had so willingly, so freely given. But there was also freedom, and that freedom tasted better than any feast I had ever prepared. The holidays came and went that year in a quiet golden blur. I decorated my home with simple touches that made me smile. A small wreath on the door, twinkle lights wrapped around the banister, a plate of cookies left on the porch for the neighborhood kids. I hosted a small Christmas Eve dinner for a few close friends, the air filled with laughter and the rich scent of cinnamon and roasted vegetables. We exchanged simple gifts, handwritten notes, homemade jams, a favorite book carefully wrapped in brown paper and twine. As I looked around my cozy living room, full of warmth and easy conversation, I realized that love had found its way back. To me, in a truer, deeper form. It wasn't wrapped in grand gestures or blood ties anymore. It was wrapped in mutual care, in chosen family, in a community built not out of obligation, but out of joy. One afternoon in January, a heavy envelope appeared in my mailbox. Inside was a glossy invitation to a large family wedding, addressed formally, almost coldly. Tucked inside the invitation was a small handwritten note from my sister. It would mean a lot if you could make your famous dishes for the reception. There it was again. Their understanding of my worth laid bare. They still hadn't learned, or maybe they had, and simply didn't care to change. I folded the invitation neatly and placed it in the bottom drawer of my writing desk, not in anger, but in finality. I didn't need to attend events where my value was measured in the weight of the plates I carried. I didn't need to serve in order to be seen. The life I had built wasn't glamorous or loud. It didn't come with applause or public acknowledgement, but it was mine. Every choice, every boundary, every quiet moment of self-respect had laid the bricks of this new foundation. And standing on it, I felt something that had eluded me for years. Wholeness. Not the wholeness of being needed, not the wholeness of being praised, but the wholeness of being enough, just as I was. The path I had walked wasn't easy. It had been lonely, painful, full of hard truths and quiet tears. But it had also been the most honest journey of my life. And as I sat by the window watching, the fresh snow blanket the world in a soft, forgiving white, I smiled to myself. I hadn't lost a family that day in the kitchen when I packed up my food and walked away. I had found myself, and no matter where the years ahead would take me, I knew now that I would never again stand on the sidelines, waiting for someone else to offer me a seat. I would always have a place at my own table. Spring arrived slowly, unfurling itself in soft greens and pale pinks across the trees that lined my quiet street. As the days grew longer and lighter, so did something within me. The house, once heavy with memories of absence and unspoken hurts, began to feel different. It wasn't haunted anymore. It was alive, it was mine. I found joy in small routines, watering the garden in the early mornings, baking loaves of bread just for myself, filling the rooms with music that made my heart feel wide open and limitless. There were no more hurried preparations for family, dinners, no frantic cleaning sprees to impress guests who would barely notice the effort. Everything I did now was for the simple pleasure of living well, of honoring the life I had rebuilt from the quiet wreckage they had left behind. Occasionally, news of the family filtered back to me through mutual acquaintances. There were weddings, births, new homes purchased, celebrations that once would have included me without question. Now, my name was left off invitations, my absence barely noted. I thought this would hurt more than it did, but strangely, it didn't. I no longer measured my worth by their acknowledgement. Their gatherings could go on without me, and I could go on without their gatherings. It was not bitterness that filled the space between us now, but acceptance. We had outgrown each other, or perhaps I had simply outgrown the role they had written for me. One afternoon, while tending the small vegetable patch I had planted behind the house, my phone buzzed with a message from a number I hadn't seen in over a year. It was my cousin, the one who used to sit at the kitchen counter and snake bites of pie before anyone else was served. Her message was short. "Thinking of you. I miss you." I stared at the screen for a long time, feeling a tangle of emotions knot and loosen inside my chest. I didn't know what her message meant, whether it was the beginning of an apology, an invitation, or simply a memory sparked by some passing moment. But what I did know was this: I didn't have to rush to respond. I didn't have to rush to explain or justify the path I had chosen. I could answer if and when I wanted on my own terms. Healing has taught me that forgiveness doesn't always mean reconciliation. Sometimes forgiveness is simply setting down the heavy stones of resentment so you can walk forward unburdened. Sometimes it's choosing peace over punishment, choosing growth over grudges. I smiled softly, slipped the phone into my pocket, and turned my face back to the sun. My life didn't need dramatic reunions or perfect endings to be complete. It was complete already, stitched together by resilience, by quiet triumphs, by the daily choice to honor the woman I had become. In the evenings, when the light faded into deep purples and golds, I often sat on the front porch with a cup of tea, watching the neighborhood children ride their bikes up and down the street. Their laughter rose and fell like music on the breeze, filling the world with a kind of hope that felt contagious. Sometimes a neighbor would wave or stop to chat, sharing small stories about their day, and I would listen, grateful for the easy warmth of connection that asked nothing in return. There were no grand lessons scrawled across the sky, no perfect closure tied up with a neat bow. Life rarely gives us those kinds of endings. Instead, there was just this, the simple, profound truth that I had survived being unseen, unappreciated, and undervalued, and I had come out the other side stronger, wiser, and more whole than I ever thought possible. I had once believed that family was the center of everything, that without their validation, I was somehow incomplete. But now I know better. The center of everything was not the family I was born into or the approval I once craved. The center was me, my heart, my peace, my joy, my fierce, hard-won self-love. That was enough. That had always been enough. And as I leaned back in my chair, the cool evening breeze lifting strands of my hair, I closed my eyes and smiled at the life I had claimed for myself, no longer waiting for a seat, no longer begging for a place, already home. Looking back, I realized that the real victory was never about getting an apology or an acknowledgement from the people who had so easily overlooked me. It was never about making them see what they had done or winning some invisible battle for respect. The real victory was quieter, deeper, and far more powerful. It was in the way I chose to reclaim my life without needing their permission. It was in the way I finally understood that my worth was never tied to how much I could do for others, but to the simple, irreplaceable fact that I existed, that I loved, that I endured. I had spent so many years believing that love meant service, that family meant sacrifice without end, that my place at the table had to be earned through endless acts of giving. But in walking away, in packing up that food and choosing to nourish myself instead, I had rewritten the rules of what love could look like. Love could be reciprocal. Love could be full of joy, not duty. Love could be an open hand, not a clenched expectation. I no longer waited for the phone to ring, for invitations that would never come. I no longer sat by the window wondering why I wasn't enough. It was enough. I had always been enough, but it took losing everything I thought I needed to finally see it. Life moved forward, slow and steady, and with each passing season, I built a deeper, richer relationship with myself. I celebrate small victories, fixing a broken fence on my own, trying a new recipe just because it sounded fun, planting a tree in the backyard, and watching it stretch toward the sky. These moments didn't make headlines. They didn't earn applause. But they were mine, and they mattered. When I thought about my family now, it wasn't with anger. It was with a bittersweet kind of gratitude. They had shown me the limits of their love, yes, but in doing so, they had also forced me to find limitless love within myself. They had taught me, through their failures, that I never again needed to beg for belonging. I carried belonging with me, stitched into every choice I made, every boundary I kept, every act of self-respect I honored. As I sit here today, the soft hum of the evening settling around me, I am filled with a peace I once thought was reserved only for other people. It turns out, peace isn't something given. It's something you claim, piece by piece. In every moment you choose yourself over the easy road of being what others want you to be. I chose myself. I chose my own seat at my own table, and it was the best decision I ever made. Have you ever reached a moment when you realized that choosing yourself was the bravest thing you could do? We would love to hear your story. Share your journey of resilience and quiet strength in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe for more true stories of dignity, healing, and the beautiful power of reclaiming your own place in the world.